My son got his teacher pregnant. At least, that's what she claimed. Now she was demanding marriage or child support, and when the DNA test results finally came back, they shocked everyone involved. I know it's unusual to share family drama online, but I genuinely need some outside perspective on the wildest situation I've ever dealt with. I own several restaurants in my city. Nothing huge on a national level, but enough for my family to live comfortably. I'm not some tech billionaire or famous entrepreneur, just a businessman who found success in the food industry. For the most part, my life had always been stable. I had a 19-year-old son who's currently in his first year of college. He's a calm, quiet kid, especially around older women, and he's never been the type to look for trouble. But somehow, trouble found him in the worst way possible. About a month ago, my son came home looking pale and nervous. Normally, he'd just say hello and head straight to his room, but that day he was visibly shaken. Later that evening, I overheard him during a tense phone call, whispering things like, "I don't know what you're talking about," and "I'm not the father." The moment I heard that, my heart dropped. I confronted him immediately. At first, he avoided my questions, but eventually he admitted what was going on. A former high school teacher had contacted him, claiming she was pregnant with his child and demanding either marriage or monthly child support payments. To say I was shocked would be an understatement. My son insisted the entire story was false. He swore he had never slept with her and had never even been alone with her. Honestly, I believed him. He's always been painfully honest, and he definitely didn't seem like the kind of teenager who would secretly hook up with a woman nearly 10 years older than him, especially a teacher. Still, hearing the word pregnant connected to my teenage son rattled me badly. I asked him if there was even the slightest chance he had made a mistake after turning 18, maybe at some party or gathering. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Dad, no. Nothing ever happened." The teacher in question had worked as a substitute teacher at his high school during his senior year, which already made the situation suspicious. She was older too, probably in her late 20s or early 30s, making the entire story feel surreal. A few days later, the teacher, I'll call her teacher, showed up at our front gate. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sitting in the kitchen organizing restaurant receipts while my son was still asleep upstairs. The doorbell rang, and there she stood with her arms crossed and an angry expression on her face. She demanded to speak with my son immediately. I calmly asked her to explain what she wanted first, but she instantly launched into a furious rant, accusing my son of ruining her life and insisting that we needed to take responsibility. Then she made an unbelievable demand. Either my son marries her, or he pays her a large amount of monthly support. The marriage part completely stunned me. It sounded like something out of a twisted soap opera. I kept my composure and asked her to sit down so we could discuss everything properly. She refused. Instead, she paced around my living room, throwing accusations at my son and insulting his character. When I asked for proof, she claimed they had secretly been involved after he turned 18 and insisted the relationship was completely consensual. But if that were true, she would still be risking serious consequences for having a relationship with a student who had been under her supervision. So why was she acting so boldly? The entire thing felt like a scam. Even so, I told her that if she truly believed my son was the father, then we would agree to a paternity test. She immediately rejected the idea, claiming she couldn't trust any DNA test I arranged because I supposedly had enough money to bribe laboratory technicians. The paranoia in her eyes was honestly unsettling. Then she threatened us. She said that if we refused to cooperate, she would take us to court, go public with her story, and destroy my son's reputation. She acted as if we had no choice except to obey her demands. The moment she stormed out of the house, I called a lawyer I knew. He advised us to insist on a DNA test and to document every interaction we had with teacher moving forward. Legal situations like this can become extremely messy, and we needed to protect ourselves. My wife, my son's mother, was furious when she heard everything. She's normally the calm and rational one in the family, but she was ready to drive straight to teacher's house and confront her personally. I managed to calm her down and convinced her that we needed to handle this legally and carefully. Meanwhile, teacher kept flooding my phone with messages, constantly switching between threats and demands. Sometimes she acted as though we could settle everything quietly if I simply paid her enough money. Other times, she insisted she wanted a wedding immediately, as if any of this made sense. She claimed she was around 5 months pregnant, which made her timeline even more suspicious. Things became even stranger because she kept insisting the baby was definitely my son's, yet her version of when they supposedly got together kept constantly changing. At that point, my biggest fear was that the courts might actually take her accusations seriously before a DNA test could clear everything up, or worse, that she'd spread rumors before we had the chance to defend my son's name. He had only just started college, and a scandal like this could completely damage his future. I could already imagine people whispering around campus. That's the guy who got his teacher pregnant. Just thinking about it made me sick. I decided to contact the principal of my son's former high school, someone I'd worked with professionally in the past. I explained the bizarre situation and asked if he could provide any records regarding teacher's work schedule during the period she substituted there. Thankfully, he agreed to help. He provided official documentation showing exactly which classes she covered and on what dates. As it turned out, she had barely worked at the school at all, maybe 6 weeks total. Even more importantly, according to the records, she had never once been assigned to any of my son's classes. That was definitely reassuring, although it still didn't completely eliminate the possibility of some after-school interaction, which was what she claimed had happened. As we dug deeper into the situation, one of my son's close friends came forward with information that made her story look even more suspicious. He said there was absolutely no way my son could have been with her during the weekend. She claimed the affair happened because my son had been out of town at a soccer tournament. Back in high school, my son had been a pretty solid midfielder on his team. There were photos, social media posts, and multiple tags placing him in another state during the exact time period she described. The more evidence we gathered, the more obvious it became that her story was filled with contradictions and holes. After a long and exhausting back and forth between our lawyers, we finally managed to arrange a paternity test. My lawyer insisted that the DNA testing be handled through a highly reputable laboratory selected by the court so nobody could accuse us of bribery or manipulation. Teachers still complained constantly about the process and kept subtly suggesting that a large payment could make the entire situation disappear. I refused every single time. Meanwhile, my son started looking emotionally drained by the entire ordeal. He had dark circles under his eyes and was constantly checking his phone as if expecting another threat or accusation. Watching him go through that stress was heartbreaking. I kept reassuring him, telling him, "We're going to fight this, and we're going to prove you're innocent." Every time I said it, he'd nod quietly, looking both terrified and relieved at the same time. When we arrived at the lab on Thursday morning, teacher was already there waiting for us. She stood with her arms crossed, glaring angrily at my son. She refused to speak directly to him and just kept muttering about how she was supposedly the victim in all of this. The nurses collected DNA samples from both of them, and after that, we were told it would take 1 to 2 weeks before the results were ready. That waiting period felt endless. My son tried to distract himself by focusing on school and working part-time shifts at my restaurant, but I could still see the anxiety on his face. Every few days, he'd ask me the same question, "Dad, you believe me, right?" And every single time, I answered the same way. Yes, 100%. But teacher refused to back off. She kept calling and texting almost daily, constantly making new threats. She claimed she would contact local news stations and accuse us of covering up a scandal. At one point, she even threatened to stand outside my restaurant holding a sign that said "Deadbeat Dad." The audacity of this woman was unbelievable. I saved every single message and forwarded everything to my lawyer. Honestly, he seemed thrilled by how strong our potential defamation case was becoming. Then, one evening, out of nowhere, I received a phone call from an unknown number. The moment I answered, a man started shouting aggressively, "Stop ruining teacher's life. If you don't pay, you're going to regret it." I demanded to know who he was, but he just cursed at me repeatedly before hanging up. The call didn't scare me, but it absolutely infuriated me. It was obvious she was trying to involve random people to pressure and intimidate us. My wife immediately wanted to file a police report, but my lawyer advised us to wait until the DNA results officially came back, so we'd have stronger grounds for harassment or extortion charges if necessary. The day the paternity test results finally arrived was one of the strangest moments of my entire life. Deep down, I had always been completely certain that my son was innocent. We had records, witness statements, and evidence proving he couldn't possibly have been with that woman when she claimed. And yet, when my lawyer called me in a serious tone and asked me to come to his office immediately, I felt a cold chill crawl down my spine. Something was very wrong. My son was already sitting in the office when I arrived, pale and visibly trembling. My wife sat beside him with her arms tightly crossed, breathing hard like she was struggling to contain her anger. The lawyer looked unusually serious. Several documents were spread across the table in front of him. Without saying much, he slowly pushed an envelope toward me and, with an expression I couldn't quite read, quietly said, "The test confirms that he is the father." For a moment, my mind completely shut down. I grabbed the papers and stared at the numbers, the percentages, the medical terminology, all of it impossible to misunderstand. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. There was in black and white. Undeniable. I turned toward my son, expecting him to finally protest, to claim there had been some terrible mistake, to deny everything all over again. But instead, he just lowered his head and nervously rubbed his hands together. "Son," my voice came out far calmer and quieter than I expected. He said nothing. His eyes stayed locked on the floor. My wife lost her patience before I did. "Say something," she snapped. "You spent an entire month swearing that woman was lying." He swallowed hard and cleared his throat, his voice trembling. I didn't think it was possible." I stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean you didn't think it was possible?" I could feel anger rising inside me, like boiling water. He took a deep breath, squeezed his eyes shut for a second, and finally blurted it out. It was a Tinder hookup. The silence that followed felt unbearable. My heart slammed against my chest. My eyes widened as the realization hit me all at once. My wife looked like she was seconds away from exploding. Even the lawyer leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes briefly, and rubbed his temples in frustration. "And what exactly does that mean?" I asked, my voice tight with disbelief and anger. He hesitated before answering. "I met her on Tinder during my senior year of high school. I didn't know she was a substitute teacher at first. I only found out afterward. She messaged me, we talked for a while, and eventually we agreed to meet up. It happened, but only once." My head was spinning. After all the threats, the humiliation, the fear, the sleepless nights, and the legal stress we had gone through, he actually was the father. I stared at him in absolute disbelief. "So you stayed silent this entire time?" I said. "You let us go through all of this, spending money on lawyers, losing sleep, getting threatened, while knowing there was at least a possibility the child was yours." He shook his head quickly. "I honestly didn't think it could be possible. It only happened one time, and I slammed my hand against the table, cutting him off immediately. "You are unbelievably irresponsible." My voice echoed through the office. "You have no idea what it means to be a man. You thought you could fool around, walk away clean, and pretend nothing happened. You thought hiding the truth would somehow make everything disappear." He sank lower into his chair, clearly ashamed, but at that moment, I wasn't prepared to go easy on him. "You deserve every second of the mess we're dealing with right now," I continued angrily. "You deserve to be sued. You deserve to pay every single cent of child support for that child. And if the law decides you should face legal consequences for this situation, then maybe that's exactly what you need to finally understand the seriousness of your actions." "Then so be it," I told him coldly. "Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen for you to finally understand that actions have consequences." My wife was just as furious as I was. She grabbed the papers and threw them toward him in anger. "You're an idiot," she shouted. "You dragged us through humiliation, exposed our family, made us defend you, made us call that woman a liar. And now we're the ones left dealing with this disaster." My son started crying quietly, mumbling apology after apology, but at that moment his words meant absolutely nothing to me. The following week, teacher's lawyer officially filed a lawsuit against us. She claimed emotional distress, humiliation, and defamation, while also demanding child support payments. But that wasn't all. She also insisted that the baby deserved an involved father and argued that my son needed to take full responsibility for his role in the child's life. When we finally appeared in court, seeing her sitting there crying in front of the judge was almost unbearable. My son sat beside me, completely silent, looking pale and hollow, like a ghost of himself. The judge reviewed all the evidence, listened carefully to both sides, and ultimately ruled exactly the way we expected. My son was ordered to pay child support. As we walked out of the courtroom, my wife still looked furious, her eyes burning with anger and disappointment. My son didn't say a single word. I looked directly at him and, without even a trace of sympathy, said, "I hope you've finally learned your lesson. Now take responsibility for your mistakes, because I am never rescuing you from your problems again." Paying the settlement was one of the most humiliating experiences of my entire life. My wife, my lawyer, and I sat down together to review the finances, calculate the damages, and make absolutely sure every cent came from the person truly responsible, my son. Because if he was old enough to lie, hide the truth, and behave recklessly, then he was old enough to face the consequences of his choices. The first thing we did was open a bank account in his name and transfer the financial obligations directly to him, including the money owed to teacher and her attorney. He tried arguing that he didn't have enough money, that he was too young to handle that kind of debt, but I wasn't interested in hearing excuses anymore. If you're old enough to create a child, I told him firmly, then you're old enough to help support one. He kept insisting he was overwhelmed and that he couldn't possibly manage everything on his own, but my wife was just as strict as I was. "You didn't think about any of this while you were having fun," she snapped. "Now you deal with the consequences." We put him to work at one of my restaurants, and not with easy part-time shifts either. He worked the toughest hours with zero special treatment and absolutely no excuses. He washed dishes, cleaned bathrooms, waited tables, and dealt with rude customers every single day. If he wanted food, he paid for it himself. If he needed something, he had to figure out on his own. He had a child to support now. And every single time he complained or said life was unfair, all I had to do was remember the humiliation he had dragged our family through. Unfair. I exploded one day after he complained again. "You want to talk about unfair? You put me through the greatest humiliation of my life. You made your mother cry. You got us sued, embarrassed, and dragged into court like criminals. And now you think you have the right to complain about fairness?" He lowered his head in silence, but that still didn't calm my anger. "You lied directly to my face," I continued. "You made us believe that woman was lying. We fought her, hired lawyers, destroyed her credibility publicly. And in the end, who was actually wrong?" I pointed directly at him. "You were. You betrayed my trust." He never answered. Honestly, that was probably for the best. At first, he still tried avoiding responsibility. He attempted to delay child support payments, claiming he couldn't save enough money and that life had become too difficult. But every time he tried to escape accountability, my wife and I reminded him of reality. If you refused to pay, I warned him, you could end up in jail. It's that simple. Very quickly, he learned that the world doesn't have much sympathy for irresponsibility. What hurt me most wasn't even the financial cost. I had money. What truly destroyed me was what the situation represented. I had trusted my son completely. I had defended him in front of my lawyer, the judge, my friends, my neighbors, everyone. I looked people directly in the eyes and declared with total confidence that my son had done nothing wrong and that the accusations were false. Finding out I had been lied to felt worse than a punch, worse than betrayal, worse than taking a bullet. At least a bullet is quick. This felt like a slow wound that would never fully heal. Night after night, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering where I had failed as a father. How could a son raised in a stable home, with loving parents and strong values, lie so easily to our faces and destroy the trust we had built for years? My wife tried comforting me by saying he was learning and growing up through the experience, but I could still see the same disappointment in her eyes that I felt in my own heart. Yes, my son was now working, studying, and paying child support. But the closeness we once had was gone. When I looked at him, I no longer saw the innocent boy I once trusted completely. I saw someone who had been forced to grow up in the harshest possible way. Then one day, while walking through my restaurant, I overheard my son speaking rudely to one of the waitresses. His tone was loud, impatient, arrogant, as if he believed he was above her. "Hey!" I shouted sharply, my voice cutting through the restaurant. He turned around immediately, and the entire room fell silent. "What exactly is that tone?" I demanded, crossing my arms. "Dad, I was just—" "Shut up." My voice echoed across the room, and he instantly froze. I walked straight up to him until we were face to face. "You already helped ruin one woman's life," I said coldly. "You already caused a woman pain, humiliation, and suffering. Do you honestly think that gives you the right to disrespect other women too?" His face turned red as he looked down in shame. "You're going to learn how to respect women," I continued. "You're going to learn how to speak properly and how to behave like a decent man. Because if I ever catch you treating another woman like garbage again, I swear you will regret it." He nodded silently, swallowing his embarrassment. He was changing now, but not because he genuinely wanted to. He was changing because he understood that one more major mistake could cost him everything. In the end, I never completely regained the trust one once had in him. My son learned a painful lesson from all of this. But I learned one too. Sometimes trusting someone blindly can become the biggest mistake of all.